Well, hello, everybody. I hope everyone is doing well. Welcome back to my channel. My name is Mark Turi. And if this is your first time on my channel, please like this video and do not forget to subscribe if you have not already. It's good to see everyone again now that I am back to a regular schedule. And nothing much on my end as far as small talk is concerned. Although, um, one interesting piece of history, because you all know how much I love history, being a historian, of course, is that today, the 19th of January of 2000, of course, and 25, is the 80th anniversary of the Red Army's liberation of the city of Budapest, which is quite fascinating. So back in 1945, the Soviet Red Army came in and liberated the city from its Nazi occupation. Of course, then it would then continue to have a hold uh, on Hungary until 1989. But I guess um, there's always good and bad in everything. But as far as that is concerned, um, quite an interesting anniversary to be and to have, of course, the 80th anniversary. So that is one thing that's quite interesting. And again, a lot of news reports on that today on television, on radio, in newspapers, print media. There were celebrations all over the city, particularly in the Jewish community, which I am a part of. There were some celebrations at certain memorials and monuments to those that helped the Jewish community during the war, including a gentleman by the name of Raoul Wallenberger, who was a Swedish diplomat that funded the resistance, Jewish resistance, and also non Jewish resistance in Hungary. My grandfather was lucky enough to have an association with him. So my grandfather is considered to be sort of saved by his efforts and the efforts of others. So I think that's quite an interesting thing, history wise. I'm sure, of course, there's a lot of other things that are going on and in history of the world on this particular date. But just the fact that I live in this city and have roots in this city now and so forth, especially familial ties to the city, I thought that was quite interesting. I know that tomorrow is a big day in the United States, and I always like to say, of course, regardless of your opinions, my opinions, whether they're good, whether they're bad, whether they're neutral, tomorrow will be the inauguration of the 41st president of the United States, Donald J. Trump. And I think I speak for at least everyone who's listening. I hope so, whether you're live or on the replay, and hoping for a peaceful transition of power. Um, and that's on all sides. Not to say that one side is better than the other, but of course, uh, you know, 4 years ago was quite a different story, and hopefully this will be better. Um, hopefully, right? That's the only thing I can do from all the way out here. I will probably be watching. I think it's going to be sometime in the evening here. I think it starts around 4 or 5 p.m. here. I think it's obviously in the morning in Washington, something around 10 or 11, somewhere around that. So I will be watching just to see, and hopefully nothing will happen. But, I was also watching the footage 4 years ago, and stuff happened that I don't think anybody really predicted. So I'm just going to watch for that. Um, Trying to also think about anything really, not too much again on my end, same old sort of thing. Mm, there's I've been watching a lot of I don't know if any of y'all enjoy cooking shows. I'm a big fan of cooking shows, so I've been watching a lot of MasterChef, which I really love the US version. I'm a big fan of Gordon Ramsay. I think he's a genius. And yeah, I sort of I don't know why I have a an interest when British people yell at Americans. I don't know what it is about that. It's just when somebody yells in a very and a very posh English accent, which Gordon has, it I just giggle. I giggle a lot, and I find it to be a very fun show. So not too much else on my end. Really, still continuing to do what I'm doing. If you've listened, for the past, I've been on since August, so if you've been listening since August of last year, so going on 6 months now. I'm still doing my schoolwork. You know, the temperatures in the city have been a little bit cold. They've been, although again, not maybe not as cold in the perspective of those on the US and Canada, Midwest, Ontario, etc. It's definitely gone very much below zero. For us, it's gone to anywhere from 0 to about -3, which is cold for us, but that's usually about the max ish for this time of year. We did have snow, uh, I guess a couple of days ago when midweek. I think midweek I woke up and opened my blinds and there was snow and it was snowing and snow was on the ground, which can be a little rare here. But by the end of the day, there was nothing, which is how it is here. But it was interesting to see snow on the ground, and it was interesting to see a lot of flurries in throughout the sky and so forth, which is again is kind of a regular here. Want to say hello here to Pete Anderson. Hope everything's going well with you. Growing facial hair. I have a very very precarious situation with facial hair. I would love to grow a very thick beard, maybe not a long one, but a thick one. But on this side of my face, I get this one like, strap. That's it. And then down here, there's nothing. So there's no hair follicles. So it's called dysplasia. I've been to dermatologists, and it happens with some men on this side. You just hair follicles, they just didn't grow when I was in the womb, I guess. So I get almost nothing here, and then here I get a pretty decent, not fully thick, but actually a pretty decent shape even in my neck. So what I normally do is if I grow it out, I just leave a small mustache here, and then I cover my double chin. So I like it. And then I'll probably shave it, in a couple days anyway, so that I'll be clean again. And I kind of go back and forth because it never works the way I want it to be. And so I just get frustrated and shave anyway. So that's probably what's going to happen. So probably by the next one or two videos, I'll be back to clean. Um, I wish that there was some surgery or pill or cream or something where I just, put on some cream and then all of a sudden it was, hair follicles would grow and I could actually grow a substantial beard. My father could do that. My father had a very thick mustache, much thicker than me. Um, when he was when we knew him, and when I was born and stuff, he had a really thick one, and then he could grow a beard, a very very full beard, but he always shaved. So who knows? Anyway, enough of my facial hair. Hey, Joe, we got two Mark Postles here. We got Peter, who of course is a Mark Postle, and we have Joe, the exalted one, who is our second Mark Postle. Of course, I gave the first one to Chad just because he joined my channel first. Um, is there a testosterone cream? Maybe there is. I don't know. I should maybe go to a dermatologist and see. I don't remember when the last time I went. They just said it's called dysplasia. And so it's like you don't have like whatever it is, there's no hair follicles here. So perhaps there is a testosterone cream that would be able to help. Because damn, I would love to have like my ideal beard, my ideal facial hair. And Joe, you're going to know who this is because I know you know who this is. Franz Joseph the First. That guy. Oh my God! If I could grow that and just have it for a day, his mustache and beard combination was gorgeous. Very hard to maintain. But if I could just have that for one day, I would be very happy. But even if I just had a 5 o'clock, like if this side, I should say, matched with this side, I would be perfectly happy. But unfortunately, it doesn't. But yeah, maybe there are some creams that I can get, and I'll come back. I'll look like an Orthodox Jew, and get this big kind of thing here. Who is this? Hey, Black Boots. I don't know what you mean. This is me, Mark Turi. Are you referring to me or referring to somebody else? I don't know, but clarify. And Pete, as you get older, you'll get hair where you don't want it. Yeah, I've been noticing that. I'm in my 40s. I know some people say I don't look it, so I tend to look younger. Most of my family looks younger, but I am in my 40s, so I've been noticing a lot of like, when I was for at least 5 to 10 years, um, I have been when I either sit in a chair or get up from a chair, I groan, I go, and then I go, you know, and there's a thing on the show Frasier. There was an episode where I guess Frasier is turning 40 because I think Frasier is supposed to be like 38 or something. Um, during the first season, so he's getting older. And his father, Martin, says, "You know when you're getting older when you sit in a chair and you sigh." And then I think at the end of the episode, Frasier does that, and you hear Martin, who's off camera, go, "I heard that." Anyway, so that's what I've been noticing. I've also been noticing like my knees. Oh my God, my knees. Like why? Like, it's not that they hurt, I'm not in pain, but, like, all of a sudden, I'll be walking, everything be great, and then one of my knees will just go, "No, no, not today," and then I'm like, "What?" Shoulder, sometimes like that. Anyway, I mean, who's using something for facial hair? Oh, okay, well, we were talking about how on this side of my face, I'm very fair-skinned and I don't have a lot of follicles, and so Joe was saying there is cream you can use. Um on this side. This side's fine for whatever reason. This side isn't. It's called dysplasia. It means that the cells and the skin cells weren't fully developed. Like it's like a birth defect or it's like a what or birth condition or whatever. And so I guess if I put cream on here, it could probably help. So they were referring to myself. Gotta be honest, I think you dodged a bullet there, not looking like French Joseph. That's your opinion. I'm just saying for one day, just for one day. I'll look like the emperor, I'll shave it off and look normal. Um, just one day. Or maybe I'll find a fake beard for Halloween one year and I'll go as Prince Joseph. Um, Here people like him. I think if I go to like Prague or something, nobody likes him there. Let me tell you. So, the stuff you rub on your head increases your estrogen, not something a man wants. Yeah, that's for sure. Um, So do you like more hair or less? I would like to have more hair, but I'm quite hairless, to be honest with you. Yeah, beard coming soon to stream. Really? Yeah. Well, I've been getting subscribers lately because I've been doing a lot of activity, posting on certain things and watching videos on how to make my channel grow. So hopefully, if you all want to do a pledge drive, once I am able to get super chats and super stickers, I can say, hey, for 20 euros, I'll go and I'll get a fake beard and I'll do an entire stream as Franz Joseph the First, where I talk about how wonderful the Austrians or the Hungarians are, and I just ignore everyone else, which he did, by the way, which he did. Not a fan of the Czechs or the Slovaks or the Ukrainians or the Poles or the Italians or the Serbs or the Croatians or the Slovenes or, of course, the Bosnians. He sort of liked the Catholics as long as they were Austrian or Hungarian. If you were Catholic, oh, he also didn't like the Romanians, but whatever. History is what it is. I just want his beard. All right, it's almost 15 minutes. Um, it's almost 15 minutes. So just one more thing here. Thank you, Black Boots. Yeah. Just in case for anyone who's wondering, of course, if you've stumbled on this through a search or anything like this, I have a whole catalog of different videos that we do on a lot of different topics. And a couple weeks ago, so about a month, maybe 6 weeks ago, was of course the 1 year anniversary of the passing of our friend Doug Scott Kramer. So I did a video memorial to him, a celebration of his life. And so I'm very thankful. Thank you very, very much for doing that, Black Boots. And I also have a lot of other stuff too. So we're going to start today, and I will take your you guys' questions and stuff after. But the topic of today in this stream is going to be what are the differences essentially between what's called the anti-cult movement and the counter-cult movement. So some questions I'm going to try to answer is, what are these movements? What are the histories of these movements? How did they evolve and how do they differ? Um, but to basically begin, what they have in common is that while both of these movements have different philosophies, and I'll get into that in a moment on the difference between anti cult and counter cult, each of these movements were born out of, pardon me, as I get some water, were born out of the counterculture movement, particularly in the United States, but also in Canada and Great Britain, Western Europe, and so forth. And then it would eventually go, into the world. But the counterculture movement of the late 1960s and early 1970s, so probably somewhere around 1967 to maybe 1974, around there, so almost a decade. Um, as of course was the Vietnam War era, the protesting on college campuses, Kent State Massacre, and so on. And one of the things that happened just a few decades earlier, especially at the end of the Second World War, was that many American Marines, GIs, sailors, airmen, etc., who were in military service that came back from the Pacific, many came back and had wives who were Japanese, Chinese, Filipino, um, etc., right? And also from places like Guam and Saipan and stuff, who have an indigenous population, as well as those that are mixed between Japanese and indigenous South Pacific Islander peoples. And some of these individuals practice Buddhism or some kind of religion, Shintoism or something, an Eastern religion or an Eastern philosophy. And after 1945, a lot of like white Americans, American born white Americans, were starting to get interested into Buddhism, and particularly again from China, from Japan, from what we used to call the Orient. Okay. Then, of course, the Korean War happens. So then that also accelerates interest in Korean religions and Buddhism. And so throughout the 1945 to, let's say, 1965, 67, that's kind of the first immigration of Eastern ideas. Now, I do want to also preference the fact many Chinese Americans and other Asian Americans and Canadians um, were in North America and working for the railroad in the 19th century. They were not really able to necessarily start their own congregations, but that history is also very dark because many Chinese Americans and Canadians who came over as workers were used in highly dangerous, explosive activities and stuff. It really horrendous how the Chinese American and Canadian labor were exploited. Many who were Buddhists, of course, again would later, you know, settle in places like Vancouver and Seattle and San Francisco, Los Angeles. They come to Toronto, New York, and again, after the war, then they were able to at least have some kind of funding and interest into Buddhism. In the 1960s, there was a lot of relaxation of laws in the United States in particular, which made it easier from those from Asian countries like India and Japan and Vietnam and Korea and so forth to actually come over to the United States, which of course means with the migration of people comes a migration of their religions. So as Buddhism was coming over, as Shintoism was coming over, as Buddhist and specifically Mahayana Buddhist, although some Theravada Buddhists were coming over after the war, but mostly again, um, there was this Mahayana and Shinto and other Eastern religions were coming over. In the 1960s, it was mostly South Asian that would come over. And of course, South Asian, we would say, is India, Sri Lanka, Pakistan, Bangladesh, Nepal, Bhutan, which are mostly Buddhist. And again, Pakistan, of course, and Bangladesh are mostly Muslim, but were minority Christians and Buddhists even in those countries. But India, Hinduism comes over, Buddhism comes over, Theravada Buddhism also from Thailand comes over, and at least by, like, say, 1967, through all of this immigration of Asian Americans and Asian Canadians who would settle in these cities like Los Angeles, New York, Toronto, Houston, Texas, Chicago, Vancouver, Calgary, Edmonton, etc., and of course in England. You'll forgive me because I'm a little bit less knowledgeable on which English cities and counties had, more Asian population during that time. But a lot came to London and the big cities, Oxford, obviously, and Cambridge having universities. Students were getting involved. And it was at this period that we started to get groups like the Hare Krishnas, which came over to England and then exported itself to North America and is now a worldwide group. Transcendental meditation gets popular with the Beatles in the 1960s. It's exported as well. And, several others, the Hare Krishnas, as I mentioned, Transcendental Meditation, various Buddhist groups, and so forth. A lot of these groups, of course, had controversy. And so, why it's important to talk before we talk about the difference between anti cult and counter cult is to bring us in our timeline of philosophical ideas and immigration up to the point of around 1967, give or take a year, maybe even two. But right around the late 1960s, the hippie movement really starts around 67, starts becoming popular in 69, and then probably around 74, 75, it sort of changes to the disco era, which then again itself sort of dies out in kind of the early 80s. But all of this is very important because young kids, let's call them that. I should say not kids, young adults under the age of 30, particularly those who are in that sweet spot of being in what in America, we call college in America, or of course, we would say university in other places. There were these young, mostly white, individuals and groups who grew up in Catholicism or Protestantism mostly, English speaking, working class to upper, to wealthy, college educated, maybe Ivy League, maybe whichever, who are getting into these Hinduism and Buddhism, and it was very odd for parents. So each of these movements kind of revolve around the idea of a group of parents, concerned parents, mostly American, probably of European background, had probably been in Europe or Canada, of course, for some generations, probably Catholic or Protestant, mainline, maybe evangelical, but definitely, Episcopalian, Roman Catholic, Presbyterian, etc. And all of a sudden, their 18 to 22 to 30-year-old son or daughter is, going to an ashram and changing their name to something Indian, or, becoming a Buddhist and maybe become a monk. So then they're shaving their head, they're wearing robes, and this sort of attack of ideas, attack of the senses, this conflict in um, how one is supposed to grow up in the United States. You're supposed to have this plan. Many people would drop out of college and university. They'd move to India or again, they'd live on an ashram or a monastery, and it was just odd for parents. They weren't really sure what to do. So the first movement comes out of this is the anti-cult movement. The second is the counter-cult movement. I'm not exactly sure which comes first. I think they sort of grow up simultaneously, but I'm going to focus first on the counter-cult movement and then move into the anti-cult movement, because the anti-cult movement will take us into the 80s. The counter-cult movement is still around, as is the anti-cult movement, okay? But it's not necessarily as prevalent as what the anti-cult movement again became in the middle to late 70s and then into the early 80s. So what is the cult movement? Okay. I mentioned before that many young people from Christian families were having these radical changes of self-identity as spiritual and religious identities, beliefs, practices, etc. And this was very alarming for their parents. The counter-cult movement was a was an evangelical Christian movement, and it essentially believed that because Christianity is true, because belief in that side of Christianity, and I understand not all Christians will agree with that is totally want to put that out there, because sometimes it's very easy to generalize, all of Christianity as evangelical Protestantism, which is not true. Um, but in this case, they were evangelical Protestants. The Bible was the Word of God, and Jesus was God. So Jesus created religion, essentially, because religion comes from God, but cults come from quote unquote man. So in this Christian movement, okay, these concerned parents got together to try to rescue their children to then bring them back into the fold, specifically as evangelicals. Um, it's not to say that there wasn't Catholic counter cult or Orthodox Christian counter cult or even like Latter Day Saints or whatever. It's just that it tended to be mostly like evangelical Christians. And in the 60s and the 70s, evangelical Christians, just like in the 50s, were a little bit more isolationist. And then once their children and once pop culture and society started to become more liberal and more pluralistic, open to Buddhism, Hinduism, Jainism, Shinto, Sikhs, etc., there was this reaction. And so the counter cult movement also starts to take, I would say, a more significant role in the 70s when the religious right and what's called neoliberal economics, this would be the Thatcherian era, the Reagan era of government, starts to come back. Because I've said this before on the channel, but roughly after World War II, let's say 1945 to 1975, conservatives were mostly isolationists, which included what are called paleo conservatives. So conservatives that were very against interventionist foreign policy. Again, I also mentioned this on my liberal versus conservative live, which I did last month. And so there was this then, once the religious right started to grow more, the counter cult movement would take over. And counter cult activists, speakers, leaders would go to churches in the 70s and even into the 80s and then talk about how you should only learn the gospel. They would reinforce the teachings of their teachings of Jesus. Again, people who are probably not evangelicals, or even if you are an evangelical, maybe you have a different interpretation. This is why I don't want to generalize. because certainly there were churches that were totally open and fine to this cultural shift. In Canada, like the United Church of Canada, and progressive churches and liberal churches were pretty open. But in this case, that sort of like idea of like the mid 70s to probably around the mid 80s takes off. And one interesting part of that is satanic panic. Satanic panic was not necessarily like you can't really call it a counter cult, counter cult thing because it became so mainstream and so wide in the United States and also in Canada and also in Great Britain and other places of the world. But satanic panic, which happened around the 80s, certainly has a philosophical and even religious uh, genesis with the counter cult movement. So people, individuals, pastors, preachers, and so forth would travel, through the United States, and they would, reinforce, especially to youth groups, especially to those that were not just under 30, but under 18, high school students, students in junior high schools, middle schools, which of course, that's the American terms. Basically, I would say at least from fourth, fifth, sixth grade. So now we're going ages 10 to 12 to about 18. Okay. So again, right in that sort of sweet spot of development, because of course, heavy metal was getting popular in the 70s and 80s, punk rock, very popular. And this whole satanic thing, Ouija boards, horror movies, supernatural horror movies were also becoming very popular, like Poltergeist. Alien movies were becoming very popular, E.T. During this era, Close Encounters of the Third Kind. And of course, this was stuff that was seen as anti Christian and secular and black magic. Um, I play and still have played Dungeons and Dragons for a very long time, and obviously that was considered to be satanic. The show Stranger Things, which of course is on Netflix, does dive into this because the Satanic Panic is a good, has a lot of themes in its seasons, particularly in the first season, but also in the most recent season, because there's a metal kid who plays Master of Puppets on top of a trailer. I think the actor's name is Joe Quinn. I think he's Irish or English. I think he's Irish. Somebody check it on that because I think he speaks Gaelic. Anyway, that's besides the point. And he's often seen in the last season as being the epitome of the satanic metalhead. And the counter cult movement itself, as the movement, is kind of, I would say, there's bits and pieces of it that are still around today because of the Satanic Panic in the 80s, but certainly by around the 90s, 2000s, it sort of dissipates. And again, that counter cult movement is very specific because it has a biblical evangelical Christian interpretation, excuse me, and affiliation. So when you think of the differences between these two, and again, I am going to get into the anti cult movement in a moment, but when you think of the counter cult movement, think of conservative, evangelical. Think of that kind of the idyllic American family, the nuclear family of like the 50s, two parents, three kids, a dog, cat, a home with four bedrooms and two bathrooms, an automobile in the driveway, probably a Studebaker, a white picket fence. And think of that as what the 60s, the counterculture was rebelling against that idea of the American dream. And so obviously if you are a parent and your expectations for your children is to have that nuclear family from the 50s and early 60s, and all of a sudden your young son or daughter who's 18 to 25 joins an ashram and changes their name, and meditates all day and chants all day, it's very was very alarming. And so the purpose of the counter cult movement, excuse me, was to counter cults with the message of a specific form of Christianity and evangelical Christianity, to bring those people back and get them to, I guess, what would you call, straighten up and fly right, I guess, is that saying. I'm not sure if that's the exact saying, but something like that, where, okay, you've had your little self-discovery, but this is what life is supposed to be. And so the counter cult movement will counteract the influence that cults, which they define as mostly Eastern religions, or religions that were founded by humans rather than God. And of course, the only religion that was founded by God, according to them, is their brand of evangelical Christianity. Buddha, they would consider a man. And of course, in Hinduism, because there are multiple deities and gods, you know, you can easily dismiss that by saying Christianity has one God, and if there's many gods, it's just not right or whatever. But these are all of their philosophical, sort of conflicts that they had with all of those groups that were coming out of India and Japan and so forth, roughly between the middle, 1940s, after the Second World War, to roughly about the time of the American involvement in the Vietnam War, which sort of starts around 1965. I believe the Immigration Act was around there. Civil rights, of course, comes in 1964, 65, 66. That is, of course, another story. But at the same time, by about 1966 and 67, there's a war in Vietnam and the Americans are involved. And so immigration also comes from that. Okay. So counter cult movement, Christian, very idyllic, family wise, and so forth. So then what is the anti cult movement? Well, again, same same genesis. We have people coming, American soldiers, Marines, airmen, and sailors in 1945 coming home with wives, or coming home just being interested, in Eastern philosophy like Buddhism, Zen Buddhism, and so forth. There was also, of course, a post-war, I guess you could say, occupation of Japan by the Allies, because they didn't want Japan to then rearm itself and become an empire again. So there was still is American. If I'm not mistaken, I think there still are quite a few American bases um, in Japan. I think there's one on Okinawa, which, of course, the Allies invaded and took in 1945 from the Japanese. Could be mistaken about that if it's still in operation, but I do believe it is. So again, these groups are starting, they're relatively small. But in the early 1960s, the idea of things like that we would call secular philosophies, which I also mention here on the channel. Um, I did with Doug, and then I did it with the Nerdy Bunch. I talked about different theological stances, different types of ideas about God, and then we talked about non-theism and secular philosophies. In the very early 1960s, around 61, 62, 63, the secular movement, meaning having no religion, was actually starting to become quite popular in the United States. A lot of families, for the first time, were becoming unchurched. So, whereas some of those Christians also would join other religions like Buddhism, the Baha'i faith, the Hare Krishnas, um, you know, um, etc., Soka Gakkai, Ekankar, Scientology, these different religions and these different groups that weren't considered Abrahamic, okay? Sikh, etc., Jainist, Shinto. A lot of people were just sort of fed up with religion altogether. And there's an author, I think he's either Canadian or American, and I forget the name of the book, but his name is Douglas Copeland. and he's written, and I think it was a fictional book about a family um, who was in a neighborhood who grew up without religion when everyone else had religion, because the families and the children who were sort of growing up around the early 60s were really the first American generation to be unchurched. So this meant that there were people who were atheists, self-described atheists, agnostics, non-theists, and then comes in the 60s and 70s groups of skeptics and especially secular humanists, um, which is a schism. Secular humanism is a schism from religious humanism, and I would actually like to do, and I'll put it up on my tab, my community tab for next week, because next week I don't have a PowerPoint. I will try to get a PowerPoint done for the end of February, which I'm sure I can do, which I'll discuss later. But I think I'd like to do one on the difference between religious and secular humanism. However, this idea of living a secular life, not having any religion. So the anti-cult movement actually comes from this idea. The idea is, and this is something that is still shared by some secular humanists in the movement, not all, but some would believe that because there is no God, because religion is essentially a human construct and therefore false, that not only are all religions false and need to be moved on from, or in some cases destroyed. So, this is what we might call anti religion or anti theism, but that it's harder to try, for example, to take down the Catholic Church or the Anglican Church or Jewish and Muslim, whatever. It's easier to target groups like Scientology because they're smaller, and it's easier to target Eckankar, and it's easier to target groups that might have tens of thousands of members rather than hundreds of millions, if not billions. In Judaism, there's 16 million, but that's still a lot. So this movement started as a sort of skeptic, humanist, rationalist type idea. A lot of these groups that they targeted had, like Scientology, some magical thinking, chanting made you feel better. Obviously, pseudoscience was involved. And so I would say that the smaller groups like Scientology, like Eckankar, like the Hare Krishnas, like the Soka Gakkai International, um, think, UFO type cults or whatever were just easier to target than the Catholic Church or the Presbyterian Church in America or the Methodist Church or Quakers or whatever. And so they're not just anti-cult, they're anti-religion. And one of the reasons, and this is maybe semantics for some of you, but one of the reasons I don't refer to what I'm doing as anti-Scientology is because anti-Scientology, which can be used in many different ways, it could mean that you are against the abuses of Scientology, which in that case I am. I'm also against the abuses of every religion and non-religion. I'm against the abuses of, non-religious and secular philosophies too, which they do abuse in some ways. I'm also against the power that established institutional churches have in governments and so forth. So I have some overlap with people in the secular movement, but there's also lots of religious and spiritual and traditional people who agree with me. But that kind of anti-Scientology can also have a connotation that, well, all religions are false and therefore they all need to be destroyed. And it's not just anti-Scientology, but you're against not only the ideas of Scientology, which, as I've said before, somebody, wants to do Scientology. That's not the issue. The issue is the abuses and their destructive and cult-like behavior. So I don't care about the ideas. I don't care about the e-meter. I don't think the e-meter does anything. But there are abusive practices. And so this is where I don't really say that I'm an anti-Scientology. I just say I'm kind of critical of Scientology, or maybe I'm, I have a different view. I'm maybe more of a critic or whatever. Now, again, there's also, people who will have maybe a different opinion on that. Maybe they'll disagree with me. That's okay. I've said before, I say it again. It's okay to disagree with me here. I'm still against the abuses of Scientology. If Scientology is done in a reformed way, in a independent way, in a self-help kind of way, it's subjective. And you know, what can I do? I'm one person. So the anti-cult movement starts with that. It says all religions are false, all gods don't exist. It is not just an atheist movement, it's more of a strong, because there are different types of atheists, as again I talk about, and different types of agnostics and different types of skeptics and so forth, which I did talk about in the secular philosophy video. And so this is gearing more towards the stronger, more anti-religious, anti-theists who really have, I think, an issue, whether it's a trauma issue or an issue of knowledge when it actually comes to what religion is and what God is, because of some maybe trauma, some anger, something deeply rooted, which again, because that's part of someone's experience, I'm not going to judge somebody for it. I just hope that they would, be able to be open to learning some of the stuff that we've done here when it comes to religion. Nerdy Bunch again, we talked about religious studies, and I'm not saying that everything religion does is always turns to gold. There's a lot of religions that obviously are incredibly destructive, like Scientology, which can be both destructive and a religion, right? So that's just my 2 cents. But the anti-cult movement in the 70s and 80s then started to be involved in what were called deprogramming. And I also want to introduce this concept because we're going to talk about another concept called exit counseling. Um, I'm against deprogramming and the way that it was done in the late 1970s, early 1980s, and even into the 90s, because what that consisted of was having a third party, a deprogrammer, who generally did not have was not a mental health professional, who would literally be kidnapped, usually the son or daughter of a couple, usually was a straight married couple, charge a lot of money, um, and they would kidnap that individual on behalf of their parents and family, charge them a lot of money, as I mentioned, and bring them to oftentimes a hotel or an office space, keep them in isolation, and ridicule them until they professed to stop being in their group. And this didn't just happen with groups like Scientology. This happened with groups that might be considered quote unquote cults, but not necessarily were they destructive. Because remember, these things are on a spectrum. There are groups that are constructive, benign, and destructive. So, it could have been some small Hindu group or New Age group that really wasn't destructive. Maybe they weren't constructive. Maybe they just weren't destructive or constructive. And there was definitely coercion involved, kidnapping was involved, and so forth. And this was very popular for a time. One of my idols, who I think in this space is great, who I think everyone should read, is Dr. Steve Hassan, who has written a lot of books, has Freedom of the Mind Resource Center. He's fantastic. He actually was deprogrammed by someone out of his cult, the Unification Church, and he talks about the negatives, positives, and negatives, but essentially saying it's mostly a negative experience, even though some people might have woken up out of their organization and got the help that they needed. Some might call that a necessary evil. In the end, it still was breaking the law, and a lot of people went back to the cult and sued their parents, and obviously, that drove a bigger wedge into their relationships. On the other hand, since around the 90s, there's been another concept called exit counseling. And exit counseling is very similar to trauma counseling. I've done exit counseling, by the way. I've done it throughout the years, um, with, people that we've seen online and stuff like this. There's, I won't say who exactly, just for privacy reasons, but you probably know who she is in Los Angeles, and I've have had a couple of sessions here and there, but it is very similar to trauma therapy and trauma counseling. It's done voluntarily and it's done with a licensed mental health professional. Because when you leave a group like Scientology, I tried to do it on my own for a number of years. It doesn't work. Flashbacks, PTSD, trust issues, depression, anxiety. I mean, and I was only in for 3 years, and I tell that to people. The damage was heavy, even though I was quote unquote only in for 3 years. It was a heavy amount of damage. And so that to me is the much better option. It is really um, something that I feel is better, especially someone who has knowledge like Dr. Steve Hassan or someone like this. And now, of course, if you are in a group, if you're coming out of a group, there are online sessions you can do on Zoom and stuff, which 20 years ago, 17 years ago this year, 20 years ago this year, I joined the Church of Scientology. So it means 17 years ago I left, and this will happen in May of this year for me. My anniversary's happened in May, and I'm just very happy that people can get help online through these types of sessions, like again, Zoom and so forth. So that's kind of the basics of it. And so for me, the anti-cult movement has always kind of been a little bit disingenuous. I do see that in our circle of what do you call it, in the circle of ex Scientologists that are on SBTV or whatever. I'm not sure if anybody is really like anti-cult in the sense that they just hate all religion. That might be their own personal view, but I don't necessarily think that those big grandiose like anti-religious or even anti-theistic um goals are a part of, they want to end the abuses of Scientology. There's definitely people who've come out of Scientology and would call themselves atheists or agnostics or skeptics. There's a lot of us that go back to the religion that we grew up with, or we go back to the religion that we were before we joined Scientology, or multiple combinations of all kinds of things, because we're individuals with agencies, right? So, that's kind of the idea. Although I tend to I tend to find sometimes when certain groups, like skeptic groups and humanist groups, and this happens a lot, is when you leave an organization, you can be kind of used. I've talked about this before, used by people in other organizations. I'm going to talk about this with Doug and some of his experiences when he first came online, excuse me, 4 years ago, and he went on people's channels, and then he would say something that the people didn't like, and then he wouldn't be invited back. And it's all politics in that case. So if you are leaving an organization, it might be really tempting to join another one, especially one that is, pardon me, especially one that supports you, but you have to be careful because you will have trust issues. And so I would say if you can do some exit counseling or do something other than just hopping into another group. That being said, I'm not going to judge people who do, because we know that there are ex-Scientologists out there who went from Scientology to a religious or a non-religious group, and you know what? They're happy. So again, it's just my opinion on that point, and that's subjective. But I always say try to take, and by the way, I also went to a bunch of religious groups and non-religious groups after leaving Scientology, and the trust issue thing was not resolved, and for me, and so I needed to resolve those before, and it took me a long time, and so that's part of the issue. So So in conclusion here with the anti-cult movement, I do think sometimes it is disingenuous. Um, but it really just depends on the group and the people and so forth. I would say exit counseling is better. And of course, today, although there is sort of the anti-cult, kind of flavors here and there around these kinds of secular humanist and skeptic groups, I don't think it's very too much popular anymore. And certainly, even within Christian churches, evangelical Christian churches, again, maybe there's some people who are still doing the counter cult stuff, but a lot of it stopped in around the 1990s. Not everything, of course, because there were two, you know, cults that were very destructive in Waco, Texas, of course, and then with the Branch Davidians, and then also um, the Heaven's Gate in 19. I think that was 97. So there's definitely been bits and pieces of it, thrown together. We also have a lot of interest in cult shows. We'll often have people who might represent the anti-cult movement or the counter-cult movement. They also might just be exit counselors. Um, Certainly Steve Hassan has been on a number of documentaries and so forth. And so, there's a lot more information out there. And these two movements are certainly not as popular as they were from like 1967 until 1975, and then trickled on until maybe the mid to late 90s. So that's what I have for these two. I'm gonna go to my start here because I missed a few of you guys. So if you won't mind staying on for a couple more minutes, I'll get through my start comments. So the first one is from Joe. I love to see you do a comparison of Hungarian with Finnish, Sami, Hanti, Mansi, Samoyedic, and other Uralic languages. I could do that in a couple months. Obviously, I'm not familiar with those other languages, but we could do, for example, a comparison of vocabulary and some grammar. And I could even, if I don't get copyright stricken, I could use videos from YouTube of native speakers speaking in these languages, which we can use as a comparison, which I think would be nice. I would just have to figure out how not to get a copyright strike. But I'm going to put that on my list because I think I have an idea for if I don't do it next week, a PowerPoint, then in February I'll do a PowerPoint, and I think I already have one. But that's definitely one I will put on my list, Joe. So I thank you very much for that. Yeah, comparing words. Yeah, I mean, I could easily do that. Hopefully I'll have to figure out if I get a copyright strike because there's so like people who speak Hanti and Mansi and all these Permian languages, like they're all online from Wikitongues and other different websites. I'd love to just share that because they're so fascinating. They're so different. They're so interesting. And then to hear the differences and the similarities between like standard Finnish, Estonian, Hungarian with some of their ancestors and different cousins and stuff, I think would be great. So I appreciate that, and I'll work on that, um, you know, fairly soon. So thank you, Joe. Well, Clearwater Chad, I don't know if it's been snowing where you are, but I think you were making hot dogs and barbecuing right earlier. It's very, very good to see you. Thank you. The shirt. Where did I get this shirt? I can't remember. I think I got it here in Hungary. So appreciate it. I'm getting old, so I wear Hawaiian shirts and flat caps and Adidas tracksuits because I don't care anymore. You know what I mean? I'm at that age. Hawaiian shirts, flat caps, tracksuits, you know, um, shoes with no laces. I'm just, you know, I don't know. I just need some chunky chains and I'm good to go. Irish Smart, I'm so sorry I didn't catch you when you posted, but you are a Mark Postle, so it's amazing that you are here. Thank you so much for being here. I always appreciate you coming on and supporting me. So thank you so much. I hope you're doing well, and I hope you had a wonderful weekend, and I hope you have a great week. Power lines to paralyze. How are you? We got quite a few people on, so that was great. So it's very, very nice to see you. Black Boots was saying it was odd how we all went to San Francisco in 1967. Yeah, that was a big hippie central point, right? Haight Ashbury. If you're going to San Francisco, be sure to wear some flowers in your hair. If you're going to San Francisco, you're going to meet some gentle. Yeah, I actually I worked at the Church of Scientology in San Francisco for 2.5 months, and I didn't like the wind. I didn't like the weather, but it was a nice city with lots of culture, and it was really cool. I did go to like Haight Ashbury, Market Street. I lived in Pacific Heights. I lived like a stone's throw from Little Tokyo, I think it's called, or Little Japan, that area. And speaking of which, they actually had a Shinto, I guess, temple or Shinto shrine, and a Buddhist a temple. So when I used to walk down on whatever street I was living, California, something. Anyway, Pacific in California, I think I lived at. I would walk down the hill, and there was a Buddhist Zen, I think a Zen Buddhist, Japanese Zen Buddhist, I think, temple, and then this Shinto temple, which I thought was really cool. Peter Anderson, question: didn't see any opinion or expression with regard to Mike Winter's passing. I respect your right not to make a statement or make a statement. Did you ever meet Mike? So I did talk about him. Yes, last week, Peter. I talked about him in my recap last week. Uh, I only made a brief statement because I didn't know Mike. I never met Mike. I messaged him once. He never got back to me, which is kind of like we get that all the time, like I've messaged a lot of people who are ex-Scientologists, especially who had YouTube channels or podcasts, and you know, you don't hear from them. You make a follow-up, you don't hear. So who knows? But never met Mike. But of course, Mike and I had tons of mutual friends, and I would have liked to have met him. Um, I just didn't know him. What I will say is what I will briefly touch on what I talked about last week, which is that his story specifically about how there is no OT 9 and 10 was not only very influential to me, but also very influential to a lot of people. And so I read Mike's book. When they were starting to do YouTube videos a couple of years ago, when Aaron and all of them were on the same team with the Aftermath Foundation, I watched a lot of those. This is how I got involved with the Neverins, which then evolved to the Nerdy Bunch. Back then when there was no separation and no drama, it was really nice. And so I watched all of the Aftermath, of course. Mike, he was in Going Clear, which was a wonderful, wonderful documentary. I know the Headleys, whatever. Like I've met them numerous amounts of times, but I never got a chance to meet Mike. But his confession, if that's what you want to call it, of you know the fact that there is no OT 9 and 10 and the evidence with the brokers and whatever was incredibly powerful for a lot of us. And so, again, I didn't know him personally, and I try to stay away from the drama because it's really nothing that I'm involved in. But I will say that I was really um, interested when he left Scientology, because I remember when he left Scientology, I was already out of Scientology at the time. And then when he started, or maybe I wasn't, excuse me, maybe when he started speaking out, I should say, and I did keep up with him for a number of years. And, it's a tragedy. He was not even 70 years old. He left, a stepson and a son. Plus, he has, two kids from his first marriage that he never saw reconciled with. I think that's very tragic, but I do think that maybe Mike's personality or his online persona, we can definitely talk about whatever. But I think just for the fact that he came out, he said what he needed to say, was probably not enough for a lot of people. Wrote a book, did the documentaries, did the aftermath, and really exposed that there's no OT 9 and 10. That was very profound. I do want to say I had a friend that passed away a long time ago, back in 2017, named Gary Scarf. And Gary knew Mike, and Gary had that feeling that Mike wasn't saying everything. I don't know whether or not that's true. I know there's always like that when Marty Rathbun came out, when people come out, there's always this idea that they're saying certain things, but then they're not saying others. I can't comment on that. I can just say that I hope what Mike gave us was what he wanted to give us, and who knows for what else. I can't say. So unfortunately, I don't have a strong opinion on that. However, I do respect him for at least showing us that there's no OT 9 and 10. There never was, and that's both sad and liberating at the same time. So if you want to go back and go to my recap from last week, I do get into that a little more. You got that shirt in 1982 in Hawaii when you did that business deal at the canning factory. I'm sorry, Joe. Listen, as much as I want to get it to Pete right now, I do not have the hat with me, the sunglasses, and that wonderful jacket, which I know you love. So I can't do the Chicago accent. I am not in character. I haven't watched, my 10-minute reel on YouTube of the best of Dennis Franz and Die Hard 2. It's a process, and I'm out of that process at the moment. But I do duplicate you utterly. Hey Tony, I don't think I've seen you before. Forgive me, or if you've been lurking or anything. Thank you so much for showing up. I'm just about to wrap up, but I do hope that you come back. Go back and watch it on the replay. It's very good to see you here. I also hope that you're subscribed. Please go to my channel. Please like the video if you haven't. And again, we're kind of wrapping up, so I just want to talk about what we're going to do next week. So as I mentioned, I'm not 100% yet if I'm going to do a PowerPoint or if I might just put something on my community tab. And I'm thinking of maybe doing religious humanism versus secular humanism. We've touched on it before. It might be interesting. Maybe it's not. And so then maybe I'll give another couple options. That will only happen though if I don't make a PowerPoint. And the PowerPoint I want to make is some of my favorite episodes of Star Trek: The Next Generation. Because there's a lot of great ones out there, and I want to make like a list of maybe 10, or at least maybe 7 to 10, sort of like what I did with the Twilight Zone. And there will be like not the big episodes, not the two-part episodes. They'll just be like the one-off episodes that I like. And maybe again, I'll give us 7 to 10 or something like that, or I'll do a top 7 and a couple honorable mentions. So if I get that ready for next week, again, you'll see it on my community tab by the end of next week. So probably by Friday, Saturday of next week. If not, you'll see on my community tab at least by the end of the week. So at least by Friday or Saturday of this upcoming week, I should say, not next week, but this upcoming week. You will see a poll on my community tab. So it's going to be either one or the other. I just want to thank everyone again for listening to me. That was terrific. I am going to go and do the time codes now and do some more stuff on YouTube to get my video out because I'm getting a little bit more traction as far as membership is concerned. Again, thank you for all your watch hours. Thank you for all your support. We've got Joe and Chad here, Tony, Powerlines, Peter, Irish Smart, Black Boots. There's a lot of you out here. I think I had at least close to 10 or more. I appreciate every single one of you, and I'm growing slowly, but again, I just thank you guys for everything. It's really great. So the number one thing though is to always come back and look at my community tab where I keep the polls, and I'll give you some news on what's going to come up for next week. So again, PowerPoint on the next generation, or I will do another topic like we did today that you will vote on. So once again, thank you so much. Everyone have a good evening. And in case I don't see you, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, and good night.